You were born beneath stained glass shadows, in a palace too cold to love you, but not too cold to sell you. The midwives whispered that your mother didn't scream during labor, that she clenched her jaw and stared at the ceiling, like the pain didn't belong to her. Maybe it didn't. Maybe she had learned, like all women of the crown, to feel nothing. By the time you took your first steps, your name was already on parchment, sealed with wax and betrayal, a treaty, a promise, a future written by men you would never meet. You were a daughter of war, but they dressed you in peace, silks stitched with birds you'd never seen, tiny slippers that fit a child's foot but walked a woman's fate. You learned to curtsy before you could speak. You bowed to men who smelled of ink and wine, who looked at you and saw territory. The older you got, the quieter you became. Not out of shyness, but strategy. Because you saw it, the way your father's advisors laughed too hard when he spoke, the way servants looked down but never away, the way your mother never stood at the window when your father rode off to battle. You learned that real power didn't shout, it watched, and so you watched too. In the gardens you plucked roses not for beauty, but to count the thorns. In the nursery, you listened to lullabies that warned of queens gone mad and princesses punished for pride. In the hallways, you learned which guards had loose lips and which ones never blinked. By the time you were 10, they said you had a stare like your grandfather, the general, cold, measured, useful. At 12, you were formally betrothed. The bells rang for peace, but you didn't smile, because somewhere deep inside you already knew you were not being married, you were being moved. Like a chess piece, across a board you didn't make, toward a king you hadn't met, in a game you would soon learn to master. The morning of your departure smelled like wet stone and melted wax. Your mother brushed your hair in silence, her fingers stiff, mechanical, like she was combing a doll, not a daughter. "You'll wear the green," she said flatly, not looking at you. It was the color of your new kingdom's crest. You hated green. The carriage they sent had no windows, no curtains to pull back, only solid wood, locked from the outside. Inside, they placed you on silk cushions as if comfort could soften exile. A guard sat across from you. Not to protect you, to deliver you. You were cargo. As the wheels turned, your childhood blurred behind you. The stone halls you knew by smell, the cracked edge of your favorite mirror, the only maid who ever dared tell you stories that weren't about obedience. You wanted to cry, but you didn't, because tears are seen as weakness, and you were about to meet a court full of wolves. At the border, a priest blessed you in a language you barely understood. At the gates, trumpets announced your arrival, as if you'd come by choice. And then, there he was, your future husband, a prince with a polished smile, eyes that darted behind you instead of into yours. He was older than you expected, not cruel, not kind, indifferent. When he kissed your hand, you noticed his fingers trembled, not from nerves, but from boredom. At the feast, they toasted to love, but love had nothing to do with it. You counted the number of men who raised their goblets without meeting your gaze. You counted the number of women who watched you with veiled pity, the kind that blooms from recognition. You had entered a palace that would never be yours, to marry a man who would never truly see you, to serve a crown that already weighed too much. But even as you smiled and played your part, one thought lodged itself like a blade behind your ribs. If they've written my story for me, I'll just have to change the ending. On your third night in the new palace, you were summoned, not to the prince's chambers, but to his mother's. The Dowager Queen. She had ruled before. A widow now, she moved like a shadow with sharp eyes. They said she'd once poisoned a chambermaid for spilling ink on a treaty. You didn't believe the story until you saw the way she looked at you, like she already knew your thoughts. The room was cold despite the fire. She offered no seat, only questions. Do you read? Yes. In what language? 3. Do you pray? When necessary. She didn't smile, but her mouth twitched, half approval, half warning. She motioned toward a small wooden door. Open it, she said. You obeyed. Behind it, nothing. Stone walls, a sealed room, empty, airless. A queen is not born, she whispered behind you. She is made. In silence, in shadow, in rooms like these. You turned to face her. I don't understand. She stepped closer. You will. One day, when your sons grow teeth, and with that she dismissed you. You returned to your chambers that night with a chill you couldn't shake, not from the cold, but from a new understanding. This was not a palace, it was a maze, and if you didn't learn how to walk its halls in silence, you'd be buried inside them. The next morning, you asked your lady-in-waiting to bring you every document, every ledger, every map of the castle. You studied like a general before a siege. You began to speak less and listen more. The queen-in-waiting they thought they married, she was disappearing. In her place, something else was forming, a quiet force, a woman who saw everything, forgot nothing, and trusted no one, not even her own reflection. Because reflections lie. They smile back at you even when you're falling apart. And queens, real queens, don't get to fall apart. They get to rule, or be ruled. There is no third option. The crown was heavier than you imagined, not because of its weight, but because of what it revealed. You thought ruling meant giving orders. It didn't. It meant asking the right questions to the right people at the right time and pretending their answers were your idea all along. You were queen now, but not sovereign, not yet. Every decision passed through 1,000 eyes, your husband's, his counsel's, the clergy, and always, always his mother, who never left court, only faded into the background like a painting no one dared remove. So you smiled, you attended, you nodded, but you also listened. You listened to the servant who cried softly after she spilled wine on the bishop's robe, to the captain of the guard who stood too long outside your door, to the cook who chopped onions while whispering rumors into the soup. The palace was a theatre, and everyone thought you were just a performer. But you were the one reading the script. You learned which ministers loved coin more than crown, which alliances were built on favors instead of faith, which noble families still dreamt of rebellion behind layers of silk and prayer. You never wrote a single word down, because parchment burns, but memory doesn't. Your husband, he was kind, applauded your charm, kissed your hand in public, but behind closed doors he talked only of heirs and horses. He was not cruel, but he did not see you. And you did not need to be seen. You only needed to be left alone long enough to become something no one expected. A threat. But you moved carefully, like silk over a blade, because the moment they knew, you'd lose everything. So you wore softer colors. You laughed when spoken to. You let them think you were adjusting. But in truth, you were remembering the locked room, the stone, the silence. The way a queen survives is not by ruling, it's by watching. It started with lace. A delicate pattern sewn onto the edge of a gown gifted by a foreign duchess. But you recognized the symbol buried in the thread, 3 crows, the sigil of a family your husband had vowed never to align with. You asked no questions, you wore the gown, and later, at the banquet, you watched your husband drink from a goblet that the Duchess herself handed him. Later that night, your husband was pale, sweating. The physician said it was a fever from poor meat. You knew better. You had the kitchen boy questioned, not by guards, by your lady-in-waiting who had once poisoned a cat to see if the rumors worked. The boy confessed nothing, but his eyes flickered when he heard the name Crowhurst. So the rumors were true. Someone wanted your husband dead, and with him gone, the throne would pass not to you, never to you, but to his younger brother, an imbecile with a gambling addiction and a mistress twice his age. The court would collapse, your sons would be swallowed, and so, for the first time, you played a deeper game. You summoned the Duchess to your solar. No guards, no fanfare, just you, her, and 2 cups of tea. You offered her a sweet biscuit. She declined. You smiled. Sometimes, you said softly, women like us must pretend we're not dangerous. She laughed, but her hands trembled. Within a week, she returned to her own court. The alliance was never spoken of again, and your husband's health returned. But something in you changed. You had tasted power, not the kind forged by armies or decrees, but the silent, sharpened kind, the kind that hides in silk and tea leaves. You began to move more carefully, not just to protect your children, but to ensure they would inherit something more than a broken name. You didn't trust many, but you learned to use everyone. The Duchess taught you something she never meant to. A queen's weapon is not her crown, it's what she knows, and what she lets them believe she doesn't. There's a strange kind of power in being underestimated. They saw your beauty, your stillness. They mistook it for obedience. You let them. At court, they called you gracious and well-bred, not political. They had no idea you were rewriting the rules beneath their feet. You had the servants rotate their cleaning routes once every 2 weeks, just enough to confuse the usual eavesdroppers. You replaced your handmaid with a girl who couldn't read, but remembered everything she heard. You began keeping track of which guards took bribes, which scribes were loyal to the bishop, which wine was served before each council meeting, and who became too honest after the second cup. And always you stayed quiet, because silence is never empty. It is strategic. It is survival. You watched as your husband began to age, not in body, but in spirit. The weight of kingship dulled him. He became slower in court, more eager to please the loudest voice in the room. And that's when your voice began to matter. Not in speeches, but in moments. A raised eyebrow, a well-placed sigh, a single sentence offered while pouring his wine. You should keep an eye on Lord Fern, you once said. He seems more interested in the crown than in serving it. 2 weeks later, Lord Fern was reassigned to the countryside, without scandal, without suspicion, without you ever being named. That was your specialty now, influence without trace, a ghost behind the throne. But ghosts, too, can become feared. There were whispers. Of course. That you interfered in matters beyond your place, that you were too clever, too involved, too aware. And so they labelled you in the only way they could. They called you curious, then difficult, then dangerous. But what they truly feared wasn't your voice. It was your memory. Because you remembered who owed what, who broke promises, who hid behind veils of virtue. And you remembered the Dowager Queen's words. One day, your sons will grow teeth. You began to wonder, when they did, would they turn on you too? Your first son was born during a thunderstorm. The priests called it a divine omen. The midwife called it coincidence. You, silent, drenched in sweat and blood, called it prophecy. You held him against your chest and whispered, "You will never belong to them." But you were wrong. He always would. From the moment he took his first breath, he wasn't yours. He was theirs, the kingdom's, the court's, the future's. Courtiers brought gifts before you even named him, miniature swords, tiny crowns, velvet cloaks for a boy who couldn't yet sit up, and with every gift came expectations, not for him, for you. You must prepare him, they said, shape him, make him worthy. So you did. You oversaw his tutors personally. You chose which histories he read and which ones he didn't. You taught him diplomacy disguised as bedtime stories, morality tucked between lullabies. And when your second son was born, quieter, colder, hungrier, you thought, maybe this one will be mine. But you were wrong again. He was born watching. His eyes followed everyone. His questions came late, but when they did, they were sharp. He never laughed easily, never cried much either. He preferred silence. Like you. The third son came years later. An accident, they said. But accidents don't cry with such rage, don't grip your finger like they're afraid you'll vanish. He was fire, fevered, bright-eyed, born with a scream that silenced a room. And somehow, in those early years, you believed, if I love them enough, if I teach them enough, they won't need to become men like the others. But you forgot something. Boys raised in palaces don't stay boys, not for long. They are watched, groomed, measured like prize horses, and you, despite your blood, your effort, your sacrifice, were always just the queen, not the king. And queens, they don't raise sons. They raise rivals. The first time your eldest son contradicted you in court, he didn't even look at you. He was 17, tall, handsome, his father's posture, but your sharp tongue, and he used it, publicly. And to dismiss your advice on a trade route dispute, you held your smile, you said nothing, but something inside you cracked. Later that night, you found him in the hall, laughing with 2 ministers who once bowed at your feet. You waited until they left. You embarrassed me, you said. He shrugged. You're not the regent anymore. And just like that, he drew the line. Your second son followed more slowly. He asked questions, probing ones. Why did Lord Renwick resign after speaking with you? Why does father say you interfere? He was testing the edge of your authority, looking for weak spots. You gave him nothing, but the fire in his gaze said he didn't believe in your innocence, only in your cunning. The third son still kissed your hand every morning, still laughed too loud, clung to your sleeve during storms, but you knew better. Affection is not protection. You had watched too many men smile while sliding a knife into your plans, and so, you adapted. You began holding private meetings without them. You made pacts with nobles they despised. You bent rules in ways they couldn't yet see. You weren't losing control. You were evolving it, but they saw it differently. To them you were clinging, manipulating, refusing to fade. They spoke to each other in private, your sons, 3 branches from the same tree now leaning away from the roots. You could feel it, like thunder behind the horizon. And one day you walked past a corridor and heard your name spoken in a whisper, not with respect, but with strategy. They weren't just your children anymore. They were becoming men. Men with alliances, agendas, and the unspoken desire every heir eventually has. To bury the queen before she becomes a threat. You stopped sitting at the head of the table, not because you had lost the right, but because you wanted to see them clearly. Your sons won BAs. I won. They took their places. Not boys, not yet kings, but princes with sharpened wills and eyes trained on your every move. You smiled at them. They didn't smile back. The youngest asked for control of the southern border taxes, the middle one demanded full command over the palace guard, and the eldest, he just watched, measured, waiting for you to overreach. You granted their requests, then doubled the tariffs behind closed doors, moved the loyalists from the guard without fanfare, and let the eldest stew in his own ambition until frustration made him reckless. It wasn't personal, it was survival. Because you saw what they couldn't, that the moment a queen becomes predictable, she becomes replaceable. So you turned whispers into weapons. Lady Virel was your spy in the treasury. Lord Benwick, though he claimed loyalty to the eldest, reported everything to you because you held his son's scandal like a dagger to his throat. One by one, you placed shadows in their courts. Your sons built influence. You built silence. And when the merchants began to grumble about the eldest's new policies, you didn't stop them. When the guard mishandled a protest under the middle son's command, you didn't shield him. When the youngest lost 200 men to an ambush, after ignoring your warning, you didn't weep, you let them fall. Not to punish, but to teach, because there is no sentiment in power, only memory, and you remembered the men who underestimated you. You would not raise sons who did the same. And yet, as you watched them struggle, as they bled, lied, and clawed their way back up, a quiet question echoed inside you. Had you prepared them for the throne, or had you created your own enemies? The first crack wasn't a betrayal, it was a letter. Slipped under your door in the dead of night, sealed with wax that didn't belong to any of your sons. You read it alone, twice. It named 2 ministers, a general, and a servant who had poured your tea for 13 years. A quiet conspiracy, coordinated, cautious, waiting. It wasn't the contents that rattled you, it was the handwriting. Because it belonged to your late husband's cousin, a man you'd exiled years ago for speaking a truth too early. You thought he was dead. You were wrong. That night you didn't sleep. You walked the halls instead. Barefoot, silent, listening. The palace felt unfamiliar, too polished, too quiet. The walls had started echoing with voices that weren't yours. You paused in front of a stained glass window, the one that told the story of your coronation. You were younger then, thinner, eyes harder. You remembered standing there, blood still drying on your boots, crown too large for your head. They had praised your strength, but no one had warned you that glass kingdoms shatter from the inside. By morning, you acted. The general was reassigned to a garrison 2 weeks from nowhere. The servant disappeared, no inquiries allowed. The 2 ministers were kept close, invited to dinner, flattered, fed, until they revealed everything without realizing it. And yet you said nothing to your sons, because something told you this plot wasn't meant to kill you. Not yet. It was a test, a tremor before the quake. and you needed to know, when the ground split, who would fall with you, and who would push you in. 3 nights later, you hosted a banquet. Not a grand affair, no trumpets, no dancers, no spectacle, just 12 chairs, 12 plates, 12 knives, polished until you could see your reflection. The conspirators were there, of course they came. Who refuses an invitation from the Queen? They smiled, laughed, drank the wine you had poisoned, just enough to burn the throat, just enough to remind them who poured it. The table was quiet at first, too quiet, until you told a story, a fable, about a lioness, old but unbroken, surrounded by younger lions who waited for her to sleep. They believed age dulled her teeth. They were wrong. When you finished, you looked directly at the general's empty seat, then at the servants. And you needed to know, when the ground split, who would fall with you and who would push you in. 3 nights later, you hosted a banquet. Not a grand affair. No trumpets, no dancers, no spectacle, just 12 chairs, 12 plates, 12 knives, polished until you could see your reflection. The conspirators were there. Of course they came. Who refuses an invitation from the Queen? They smiled, laughed, drank the wine you had poisoned, just enough to burn the throat, just enough to remind them who poured it. The table was quiet at first, too quiet, until you told a story. A fable. About a lioness, old but unbroken, surrounded by younger lions who waited for her to sleep. They believed age dulled her teeth. They were wrong. When you finished, you looked directly at the general's empty seat, then at the servants, and then at the 2 ministers. They didn't speak, but their eyes did. One was trembling, the other calculating. And across the room, your youngest son was watching. He was not part of the plot. You were certain of that, but he had heard whispers. You could tell by the way he studied your every move. He was learning, not about loyalty, but about power. He would not be the same boy tomorrow. By the end of the night, you offered a toast. To tradition, you said, to truth. And then you let silence follow, the kind of silence that forces men to fill it with their own guilt. You left the banquet before dessert, let them digest their fear without your presence. In the mirror of your chambers, you saw it clearly now. Your sons would inherit a kingdom built on betrayal, sealed with strategy, and bound by blood. But first, you had to survive your own legacy. You began walking the halls at night, not for paranoia, for certainty. You wanted to see it with your own eyes. The shifting guards, the flickering lamps, the new servant who didn't bow quickly enough. You counted doors, measured silences, watched shadows stretch too long behind drapes, because something had changed. They had not moved against you yet, but they had stopped fearing you in private. One day it would show in public, and when that day came, you'd either be 10 steps ahead or buried beneath their cheers. You summoned the palace architect, a man with no tongue, removed for treason but kept alive for usefulness. You gave him one task: build a hidden passage from your chambers to the lower barracks. He nodded, not because he agreed, but because he didn't have the luxury not to. While he built, you rewrote command. You replaced the commander of the gate, reassigned the baker who served the council, and when the royal scribe asked why, you simply smiled. Loyalty is like bread, best when it's fresh. Your eldest son approached you that evening, eyes curious, voice calm. Why all the changes, mother? You looked at him for a long time, then answered with a question. Do you know how to kill a queen? He said nothing. You continued. You don't stab her in bed, you starve her of trust. He understood. You could see it, and that terrified you more than any coup, because the rebellion outside your gates could be named, faced, and punished. But the one inside your bloodline? That one wore your smile and walked like your shadow. The rebellion didn't start with a sword, it started with a whisper. A noble woman who refused your invitation, a merchant who suddenly stopped offering tribute, a general who paused before kneeling, not refusal, just hesitation. But hesitation, in a palace ruled by fear, was the loudest kind of defiance. You tested them, you gave lavish gifts to one, silence to another, a public threat to the third. Only one flinched. The others held your gaze, and that was more dangerous than any dagger. So you, sir, hifted. You knew how to lose battles to win wars. You let them believe they were gaining ground. You invited dissenters to dinner. You toasted old enemies with poisoned compliments. And behind every laugh you took notes. Each word, each glance, each pregnant pause between sentences was a breadcrumb on the path to betrayal. But you weren't afraid, not because you were stronger, but because you had nothing left to lose except your name, and your name, unlike your body, could survive execution. So you began writing your own history. Letters forged in other hands, testimonies crafted in secret, scripts rehearsed by loyal ghosts who would speak when you could not. If they burned you, they would burn a woman already beloved, already martyred, because even if they struck the match, you had already lit the legend, and while the court played games, you built stories. The rebellion thought they were removing a tyrant. They had no idea. They were crowning a myth. They didn't want justice. They wanted a performance. Your trial was never held in private chambers. It was staged in the grandest hall of the empire, beneath banners that once carried your crest, now lowered, now torn. The crowd didn't arrive for truth. They arrived for blood wrapped in ceremony. A trial? No, a funeral in slow motion, where you were expected to bury yourself. They read accusations like lines in a play, voices trembling with rehearsed outrage. The same men who once kissed your rings now called you traitor, witch, liar, monster. Each word like a stone, each sentence a strike, and still you didn't blink, because what they called pride was actually memory. You remembered the nights you fed their children. You remembered the treaties you bled to sign. You remembered the famine you ended with your own grain stores. They remembered too. But memory is inconvenient when the world needs a villain, so they twisted it. Your mercy became manipulation, your power a perversion, your silence an admission. And when they called their final witness, a servant girl coached to cry, even the thunder outside the palace seemed ashamed. But still, you stood, not defiant, not broken, simply present. And in that presence you became something the court could not punish. Unyielding. It wasn't a verdict, it was a ritual. The High Chancellor didn't look at you when he spoke, his eyes fixed on the scroll in his hands, as if the parchment itself demanded obedience. By order of the People's Tribunal, he began, but there were no people in the room, only predators in robes. The sentence was not death. That would have been merciful, that would have given you the dignity of finality. No. They sentenced you to obliteration, your titles stripped, your lands confiscated, your name erased from the imperial ledger. Your portrait was taken down from the Hall of Ancestors, dragged through the mud, burned before the weeping faces of your few remaining loyalists. But the worst, they declared that your story could no longer be told. The scribes were ordered to strike you from the official history scrolls, the monks forbidden to speak your name in prayer. Even your tomb, prepared in stone, was to remain empty, a living ghost. And the people, they cheered, because they were told it was justice, because they needed someone to blame for the drought, for the wars, for the cost of bread, and because it's easier to watch one woman fall than to face the crumbling pillars of their own empire. The night before your exile wasn't filled with rage, it was filled with silence. A silence so deep you could hear the cracks in your soul, splintering like ancient wood. The guards posted outside your chamber didn't speak, not to you, not to each other. They had been told that your voice was poison. Inside, the candles flickered low. The velvet drapes had been torn down. No more luxury, no more legacy. You sat at the same desk where you once signed decrees of mercy. Now your ink dried cold beside an empty parchment no one would read. You weren't afraid of leaving, you were afraid of being forgotten. That history would belong to the liars. That truth would be buried beneath the feet of those who had never bled for this nation. That your child, if they survived, would grow up in a world where your name meant nothing. So, in that last hour, you didn't pray, you didn't weep, you wrote. Not for the court, not for the people, for the future, for the one soul who might one day dig up your memory and ask, why did they fear her so much? The carriage that took you away wasn't gilded in gold like the one that brought you to the capital. It was wooden, narrow, unmarked, like a coffin on wheels. The roads were lined with citizens, not mourners, not well-wishers, just eyes, hungry, vacant, suspicious. Some threw stones, most said nothing, but their silence thundered louder than any rebellion. Even the horses seemed ashamed to be pulling the weight of a woman declared unworthy of remembrance. At the city gates you turned once instinctively to look back, but there was nothing behind you except smoke. The banners that once bore your sigil had been torn down or set ablaze. The temples that once prayed for your wisdom now rang bells for your downfall. And still, you did not cry. Because exile is not grief. Exile is the absence of grief, the state of being too emptied out to mourn what you've lost. You wore no crown that day, but in the tilt of your chin, in the refusal to bow as you crossed into the wasteland, you still looked like a monarch, just one, without a kingdom. The first days of exile tasted like rusted metal and old fear. The air was thin where they sent you. A cliffside fortress that had once been used to break the wills of fallen kings. Its halls echoed with the footsteps of people long dead, or worse, forgotten. They gave you a single room, a broken quill, and silence. No servants, no visitors, no names spoken alow. Duh, but memory doesn't die just because no one speaks it. You whispered your son's name into the cold stone at night. You said it again and again like a prayer you weren't sure anyone could hear. You watched the sea batter the rocks below your window, relentless, unforgiving, just like the people who called themselves just. But here's the thing about ghosts. They don't ask for permission to haunt. You began to write again. Letters, testimonies, warnings, not to be sent, but to be found. You scratched truths into the backs of rotting cabinets. You braided names into the threads of old tapestries. You etched entire confessions into the wooden floor beneath your bed. And somewhere deep down you knew they could bury your body, but they'd never bury the story if you made it impossible to erase. Years passed, seasons changed, empires shifted like sand, but your name remained banished from lips, scrolls, and sermons. Until one day the wind carried a rumor up the cliffs like an old friend returning. A rebellion. Small, scattered, led by those who had studied your policies in secret, who had found your warnings carved beneath floorboards and painted behind false walls. They called themselves the remnants, not soldiers, not nobles, just ordinary people unwilling to let memory rot. And then someone said your name aloud. For the first time in a decade, your name crossed a border without being chased by the word traitor. It was whispered in candlelit cellars, sung in code through street vendors' chants, even scribbled into children's books under the guise of fables. You weren't just a woman anymore. You were a symbol, a myth with marrow, a ghost that refused to fade. And far away in your stone prison you felt it, like a tremor in the bones. History had blinked, and in that blink you slipped back in. Not by force, not by crown, but by the one thing no empire can silence, truth returned. When they came to retrieve you, they didn't send soldiers, they sent a single messenger with shaking hands and eyes that couldn't meet yours. He didn't speak your name, just said, "The council requests your presence." Not commands, requests, because power, true power, no longer sat in their chairs. It pulsed quietly in the streets, in the songs children hummed without knowing where they'd learned them. You walked into that chamber, not as a prisoner, but as a mirror they'd spent years trying not to look into. They were older now, paler, their robes heavier with guilt than gold. And when you stepped forward, they flinched. Not because of what you carried, you held no weapon, but because of what you embodied. A woman who had once held the future and was punished for it. A woman who lost everything but her voice, and made that voice eternal. One of them asked, "Why didn't you stay silent?" You smiled, softly, sharpened with sorrow. Because silence would have made me one of you. And for the first time, they saw not their enemy, but their reflection. Twisted, terrified, and too late to change it. No crown was offered, no throne restored, no parade marched you through the capital. But what they did give you was something rarer, the floor. For the first time, you were invited to speak, not to defend yourself, but to define a path. You didn't raise your voice, you lowered it. So the chamber had to lean in, so every syllable sank into their ribs and stayed there beating in time with truth. You didn't speak of revenge or retribution. You spoke of bridges, not burned, but rebuilt, stone by shaking stone. And as you spoke, the scribes didn't write law, they wrote memory. Not the empire's version, but yours. Your voice filled the hall like sunlight through stained glass. Not blinding, but beautiful, and undeniable. By the time you were done, there were no cheers, just silence. The kind that comes when a storm brews, chaos, and all that's left is the sound of survival. They didn't vote. They stood. All of them. Even the ones who'd tried to erase you. Because in that moment you weren't just a woman with a past, you were the future. Spoken aloud, history tried to forget you. They burned your records, struck your name from the scrolls, repainted murals so your eyes no longer stared back. But memory is a rebel, and truth hides in strange places. In lullabies hummed by grandmothers who still remembered the sound of your chains. In carvings at the base of wells where children whispered your name like a secret wish. In books passed hand to hand under moonlight, your story scribbled in the margins like forbidden scripture. You didn't vanish. You multiplied. Every girl told to sit down felt you rise in her spine. Every boy who dared to listen heard your words like thunder in the quiet halls of power. They called you dangerous, and they were right. Because you reminded the world that the past doesn't stay buried, it blooms. And one day, someone would look at the ruins, trace the cracks with their fingers and say, "This is where she stood. It wasn't meant to happen. Not like this." The court was supposed to forget, to move on, to bury the truth beneath enough paperwork and silence that no one would notice, the blood still on their hands. But someone brought your name back, not as a whisper, but a roar. And suddenly the courtroom filled again, not with judges or soldiers, but with ghosts, not the kind that haunt halls, the kind that testify. Your story became evidence, your scars, exhibits, your voice, the final argument. And across from you, those who once smirked in power now shifted in their chairs, trapped in a trial they could no longer control. They tried to object, but the world had already heard you. This time the verdict wasn't right, 10 in Latin, or signed with a royal seal. It was carved in the collective conscience of a generation that finally asked, who let this happen? And more importantly, what do we do now?